I'll confess to you right up front that when I sat down to write yet another sermon on the Good Shepherd, I cringed, moaned, and whined, and then put my computer to sleep and went out for a walk. Why, you ask? Why wouldn't it be an utter joy to write another sermon on the Good Shepherd? Well, if you grew up in the church, you, like me, might be carrying some shepherd baggage too. For example, was the 23rd Psalm the first psalm you memorized as a child? Did you spend umpteen hours in Sunday school or vacation Bible school making sheep out of toothpicks and cotton balls and Elmer's glue? Or how about singing, I just want to be a sheep, ba 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 ba, dozens of times over your years growing up? And did you ever stay after the morning service in the church sanctuary or the basement, staring at that all too familiar painting of Jesus wearing flowing robes with an adorable lamb perched on his shoulders, and wonder to yourself, how come God never swept down or sweeps down from heaven to cuddle you? See, I find the Good Shepherd passages in John's Gospel difficult for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, the metaphor is so shop-worn and its beauty buried under so much saccharine piety and Hallmark card sentiment that I can't even think about it without rolling my eyes. At the same time, I'm also well aware of the fact that I have no real-life idea what Jesus was talking about when he describes himself and the whole scene in terms of shepherds and sheepfolds and pens and hired hands and wolves. Now, it's true that Jesus was an effective teacher because he used metaphors and images familiar to his audience. And so when he spoke of sheepfolds and vineyards and mustard seeds and fishing nets, he wasn't spouting exotic stuff, but was wielding the material of first century peasant life in Palestine. Me, though? I've never herded sheep, or even been on a first name basis with a real shepherd. Although I have served congregations that had members who raised pigs and were dairy farmers, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise to any of you, but I have never fought a wolf once in my life. I did grow up visiting my grandparents' farm, but I never saw my grandfather, or my grandmother either, drape baby animals over their clean-robed shoulders. In fact, what I remember is that most of the time the animals on their farm stank, and often at the end of a long day in their midst, so did my grandparents. So how the church moved from the mud-stained hardships associated with honest-to-goodness raising and caring for animals to a manicured Jesus cuddling a lily-white lamb is just beyond me. I mean, people around here can't even keep their dogs clean and dry after a morning walk in the rain or on the beach or on trails. So, lily-white sheep out in the fields? Not a chance. And what I know about, and I do know this, I know that sheep are dumb and skittish. They wander until they get lost. They get hurt easily, graze without ceasing, and seemingly bicker for no good reason. I also know that they can be stubbornly stupid and will follow any leader blindly. So, along with Debbie Thomas, I wonder how Jesus puts up with me, with us. As she writes it, does he fight loneliness and boredom and frustration when I ignore him in favor of other greener pastures? And as he watches the stubborn, dumb things I do, does he hope against hope that I won't injure myself once more? It is true that he rescues me from death all the time, but I, so often oblivious, resist his care and protection tooth and nail. And this is me again. The more I read John 10 and Psalm 23, the scarier they sound, because I'm always astonished at how much we really fail to see in them. I mean, we read about the psalmist's banqueting table, but it's surrounded by his enemies. And still waters and green pastures eventually lead to valleys of death. And the reality is that as the Good Shepherd, Jesus lives on the edges of polite society. His life is perpetually in danger. And again he faces the mockery of the priests, the ones who are supposed to be shepherds, but who consider his self-sacrificing attitudes and words to be absurd. And again, as Debbie Thomas notes, because he's in it for the long haul with his flock, Jesus not only frolics with the lambs, but wrestles with wolves. Not only tends the wounds of his beloved rams and ewes, but buries them when their time comes. So, thinking of that, maybe it's no great mystery why the church has turned this shepherd into a greeting card, because it's so hard to face who he really is, and even more to contemplate what he requires of us. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. So says the writer of 1 John in today's second reading. And then, of course, writes David Losey, a Lutheran seminary president, there is that section in the middle of Jesus' discourse on being the Good Shepherd where he makes this bold assertion, that I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold, and I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd. Now, I'm sure we've all noticed that verse, and even more than just noticed it, struggled with it, and with its theological implications. Well, what strikes Losey is that the import of this verse is quite simply that Jesus isn't done yet, that he isn't finished what he came to do. Despite his healing and his preaching, despite all that he's done and planned to do, Jesus isn't done yet. He has more sheep to reach and to gather, sheep that are not in this fold and not in this flock. And what that means, says David Losey and I, what that means is that God isn't done yet either. And that's something that matters for at least two reasons. First, in Losey's words, God continues to call people from all walks of life, from every nation on the face of the earth, and from each and every generation across the 2,000 years since Jesus first uttered these words until today. In fact, if that weren't true, you and I would not have come to faith, and we certainly wouldn't be giving our lives into the service of God. And second, the members who will one day constitute or belong to Jesus' flock are beyond our imagining, which means that there's a tremendous expansiveness or reach to Jesus' statement here. And we don't know, for neither Jesus nor John tell us, just what the limits are of this fold that Jesus describes. All we know is that Jesus, and therefore God, that neither of them are done yet. Jesus is still calling, God is still searching, and in time we will all be, as Jesus says, one flock under one shepherd. And I think it's this last point that is the most troublesome and the most comforting for me, because I know more and more people who are worried about friends or family members who no longer go to church or who don't necessarily identify as Christian anymore, or who have married people of other faiths, or for that matter, have friends or family who are followers or adherents of others' faiths. And so it's the message of verse 16 that stands out to me where Jesus speaks of that other flock. I mean, who are those sheep, those on the outside, that will one day be brought on the inside? Well, he says that could it be that the other sheep include the Gentiles that Jesus meets and heals, or the Samaritan woman, a religious outsider, whom Jesus meets at a well and engages in a rather interesting theological conversation about worship? And what about the tax collectors, those public sinners that he has dinner with? And then there are the women who follow him. That's definitely a no-no in that society in that time. And then there are the lepers and the sick and injured who look to him for help and find it. Time and time again, Jesus welcomes into his fold those whom his culture considers unclean and outside the margins. So could they be the others? And when it comes to us, who are those outside our flock, our fold, who are hardest to love and hardest to lay down our lives for? Are they those who have serious reservations about joining any church at all, let alone ours, because they have difficulty signing on the dotted line in terms of what they're supposed to believe and confess, or who they're permitted to fall in love with and marry, or how they self-identify in terms of gender or pronouns, or these days especially, have different color skin? Could they be those others? And of course there's that really difficult question and complex issue about those from other religious traditions. Are they part of God's flock? And if so, how? Daniel Clendenin notes that in the World Christian Encyclopedia, compiled in 2001, the editor, David Barrett, identifies 10,000 distinct religions, 150 of which have 1 million or more followers. So, is it reasonable, therefore, Clendenin asks, to believe that Jesus is the only way to the only God, and that the other 999,000 religions are false? What's a Christian to think? How do we deal with that reality? Well, he says that many people today, maybe even most, favor some version of pluralism. That is, the belief that no one religion can or should claim to be the only religion for all people, and therefore superior to all others. And honestly, religious pluralism sounds and feels good. It tries to capture the high moral ground, and I've always wanted to subscribe to it. But although I can try and do so in my heart, I can't really do so in my head, because I don't think it's true. After all, some religious views and practices seem clearly false, clearly harmful, even despicable. Cult leaders who sexually or otherwise use or take advantage of women or children who belong to their cult don't deserve religious parity with Mother Teresa. In the same way, Aztec human sacrifice, Hindu widow burning, honor killing of young females, putting babies to death just because of their gender, plus a long list of similar religious convictions or actions, none of those should be viewed as a true faith. In other words, pluralism that consistently treats all religions as equally valid comes at the unacceptably high price of endorsing the demonic as well as the divine. And so Clendenin concludes most people do not and should not believe that all religions are true, because some religions are clearly false. Similarly, he goes on to state that the claim that all religions teach the same thing is silly, precisely because that's what they do not do. Now, it's fair to say that on a general level, one can document broad similarities among many religions, such as various renditions of the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But when you examine the historical and theological particulars of religions, you discover drastic differences. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all famous for their radical monotheism. All of them teach that their religion is right about the one true God. But Shintoism, Hinduism, and many African traditional religions are polytheistic. That is, they worship many gods, while Buddhism is non-theistic, confesses no God. And then, of course, there's atheism, which denies the very existence of God. As a result, according to Clendenin, two conclusions follow. First, it is patronizing in the extreme to say that all religions teach the same thing, and therefore we can and should tell a Muslim or followers of Baha'i, for example, that their beliefs are really no different at all from those of a Rastafarian. And second, contradictory religious claims like the ones I've just mentioned and others might all be false, but they can't all be true. Monotheism and polytheism, for example, can't both be right. A rule of thumb in biblical interpretation is to understand the complex and ambiguous parts of Scripture in the light of simple and straightforward passages. And so for Christians, it's unthinkable that God will treat any person of any time, place, or religion unfairly. Or to put it another way, as Christians, we are unqualified optimists when it comes to the nature and character of God. And so while there are many things in the Bible I don't understand, I do have absolute confidence that God will treat every person with perfect love, since God is love. Thus, at the end of the day, and at the end of this sermon, I want to say that it's not really the parts of the Bible I don't understand that bother me, such as the questions of religious pluralism. It's more often the parts of the Bible I do understand that bother me, like the call to love God with all my heart and to love my neighbor as myself. That's hard. To wrap this up, let me say that while I don't think a sermon is the best place or the right time to hash out the merits of a universalist versus a particularist view of ultimate salvation, I do believe that we can say with confidence that God isn't done yet. That God works in ways beyond our wildest imaginations to bring together one flock, and that Jesus Christ's mercy and grace are for all, will be for all people, and for the whole of creation. And should you ask me what allows me the boldness to proclaim that, even if and when and though I don't know for sure the fate of various people that you and I are concerned about, well, it's just this: that Jesus is the Good Shepherd, the one who laid down his life for the sheep, for all the sheep, and who was raised to life again as confirmation and validation of his sacrifice and his promise to bring those other sheep into his fold. So, for me anyway, while we may not know all that God has in mind for those who have followed different spiritual paths, I nevertheless entrust them all to the mercy and grace of the Good Shepherd, just as I entrust myself and all of you and all those I love to that same mercy and grace. Amen.